Hello and welcome. I'm your host, author Ryan M. Oliver, and this is the Mighty Books Podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Mighty Books Podcast. Today's with me's featured author is Flora Qian. Flora, how are you this morning?
I'm all right. I'm still fighting this horrible cold.
Ah,
So this is not my usual voice.
oh,
But it's actually interesting to hear me talking like this. It's like hearing a different person, you
oh,
know?
really? You sound
Yeah.
fine to me, but I mean, we really haven't talked much in the past, so I have nothing to base it off of. You sound fine
Right.
to me. I can understand you just fine. No, not too nasally at all. It works out well. But yeah, this stuff's going around. It's a thing. It's a thing. But we're here to talk about your story, your book. What is the
hmm
title of the book we're talking about today?
So my novel is called South of the Yangtze. And the story starts with the protagonist, Yinan, taking the high-speed bullet train with her American husband in China through the landscape of Jiangnan, which means south of the Yangtze River.
Mm,
So that trip reminds her of the first time she took the same journey down the same route in the 1980s when she was a child. At the time, she was living with her grandparents in Shanghai. Her grandfather was a historical counter-revolutionary, and her grandmother was semi-literate. Her father was a philosophy professor, and
mhm.
her mother used to be a Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution. Yes.
Wow. Wow.
So later when Inan goes to school, she receives a nationalist education and she befriends with a classmate who aspires to join the Communist Party.
Mhm.
And later, when Inan is in high school, she finds herself trapped in a secretive relationship with her high school teacher, who used to be an activist
Mhm.
during the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest, which, as most of us know, ended up in a horrible massacre. So, amid these formative relationships, Inan contemplates on her nation's ideology, tradition, and even the written language itself. So she decides to read and write as much as she could in English, and that leads her to eventually leave her hometown, Shanghai. Yeah,
Wow.
that's the basic premise of the story.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I mean, very in a huge arc of kind of history of China's political and social times during that time.
Mhm.
So, what inspired you to write this then? What drove you to write it down and share it?
Right. This story has been with me for a very long time. My whole life, if you would say. It was definitely inspired by my own upbringing, growing up in Shanghai in the 1980s to the 1990s. But I started writing the first draft in 2018 when I moved back to Hong Kong for the second time. So, I was born and raised in Shanghai. I moved around a lot, but I spent most of my time in Hong Kong on and off for over a decade. So in 2018, I moved back with my husband,
Hmm.
and we were just married a year ago. We took a trip in China to my late grandparents' ancestral village in Zhejiang province. So Zhejiang is a large province just beneath Shanghai. It's very prosperous. It has rich cultural heritage, all these good things in Chinese culture, poetry, calligraphy, green tea, wine, silk. You can find a town in that region that is famous for it.
Hmm.
So that trip brought back a lot of nostalgia for me, of this world that I left behind.
Hmm.
And I realized that my family has deep roots in this area for over 1,000 years. My last name Qian, Qian, is a fairly large family name specific to that area. So there once was a King Qian that ruled this region
Oh,
1,000 years ago.
oh wow.
Yeah. And there's still temples there today honoring this king. And one of the major rivers in this province is called Qian River.
Oh,
So yeah, I knew that my family is like a big clan in
yeah.
that area, and they stick around. They never left, right? But I was the one who made the decision to migrate. And there is a lot of freedom coming from migration, but there is also a lot of homesickness
Oh,
and
yeah.
a lot of sadness. So I started the novel in a way to work through these emotions.
Hmm.
And later, when I was writing it in 2019, the Hong Kong protests started. And I think that provided a lot of exigence or urgency for me to finish the novel. I think, you know, ever since Hong Kong was decided to return back to China in the 1980s, there is always this bewilderment, sadness, a lot of certain voices in Hong Kong.
Hmm.
But there is also this quiet unity that bonds the society together. But I felt that in 2019, at the height of the Hong Kong protests, the polarization of people's views and the color of their politics
Hmm.
made everybody very unhappy at the time. This is not specific to Hong Kong, of course, it's
No.
everywhere in the world,
Yeah.
right?
Humanity in general. Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think at the time I felt that telling a story, especially a personal story, is my small way of building those bridges. And I think that's why I like the novel form so much. At the time, I feel like people need to not only listen, but listen longer and not just taking a glimpse of other people's lives, but, hear the whole story of where people get where they are.
Hmm.
And I think, otherwise, every of our nuanced emotions, feelings deserves an anchor, right? And otherwise, that kind of social emotional isolation will only benefit an autocrat who will always encourage this kind of isolation,
Hmm.
so that they can take over as the only voice for the people who feel that they're not being heard, right? So that's why I wanted to build the bridges between people by telling a personal story. And, from where I came from, Shanghai, I think at the time I have lived in Hong Kong for over a decade, I think share a lot of similarities with Hong Kong. So both were cities that were once colonized and westernized,
Hmm.
but both have a very strong regional identity and its own dialect, actually, Shanghainese and Cantonese.
Oh, okay.
So when I was growing up, there are lots of waves of language assimilation.
Yeah.
So the government was pushing Mandarin to take over regional dialect.
Oh, okay.
Um, and Shanghai was probably one of the cities most reluctant to forsake its own regional identity. And in 2019, during Hong Kong protest, I felt that this is what's going to come for Hong Kong. And I felt a lot of empathy for Hong Kong, at a time. So I felt that my story is relevant and worth telling, and that helped me finish the book.
Oh, yeah. A nice little
Yeah.
external push to get you through writing and finishing it up. So how
Right.
long did it take you to finish when you finally sat down and got really working on it? How long did it take you to finish?
Well, I think I'm one of those writers who like to finish or push through the first draft
Yeah.
as fast as I can and let it sit for a while and just keep revising it, keep coming back
Absolutely.
to it. So I finished the first draft in about a year. I spent the next 2 years revising it. I think the manuscript went through five, six major drafts, and the final product is very different from its first incarnation, I would
Okay.
say.
Yes, it takes a lot of polishing. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. You come back, you have fresh eyes. Did other people take a look at it too and help you out, kind of formatting it, or was it really just a solo project for a while?
It was a solo project for a while. You know, my husband was my first reader.
Oh, of course, yeah.
But yeah, I sent a few beginning chapters to a couple of friends, but
Mhm.
yeah, but then the story changed so much.
Oh, yeah.
I think, yeah, I was not very comfortable at the time to share it before I actually had a clear idea where it was going.
Right. So with that comfortability, so this story, how much of your story, of your own personal story, is
Mhm.
mixed in with the actual, it's technically a fiction story, but it's, would you call it more historical
Mhm.
fiction, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's more categorized literary fiction in
Literary
general.
fiction.
It's
Okay.
yeah, not just history.
So how much of your story and the actual reality of China's past are combined? Is it
Mhm.
a lot of you and a little bit of this, or I mean, I guess it kind of correlates together anyway. I mean, how much of this story was really coming straight from you and your memories?
Right. I think there was a lot of me, but a lot of it is fictionalized.
Mm.
I had a lot of artistic license in this.
Oh yeah.
I did combination of characters. For example, the grandfather character in my book is a combination of both my paternal and maternal grandparents and one of the brothers of the grandparents. So I did that with a lot of other characters. But I think for me, what's fascinating in fiction and what's important is the emotional truth instead of the factual accuracy, right? So even though the grandfather wasn't a particular character, but my feelings for that generation is there in my book. Yeah, and I think another thing I think another important thing is the authorial distance. So where does the narrator stand? How far away is she from the events in time?
Yeah.
And the level of consciousness about what these events mean. So my narrator is definitely older. She is in her mid 30s, and
Okay.
she's looking back at her childhood to her mid 20s in terms of time. On the other hand, she is just awakening from herself for the first time
Mhm.
and looking at her old world and old experiences with a fresh pair of eyes.
Mhm.
So she is transforming as she is narrating the story. I think that emotional distance is very close, and that's the kind of intimacy I
Mhm.
wanted to create
Mhm.
for the story. And that's what I think is so special about coming of age stories in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah, it probably poured a lot of emotion into the book, especially with like you said, the nostalgia you spoke of. Nostalgia is something we
Mhm.
all experience, after several decades, especially if you're home away from home and you think fondly of those, growing up and friends maybe or family you left behind, the nostalgia hits harder. So when you wrote the book, was it kind of a struggle emotionally to get through writing the story, or were you pretty solid base wise, emotional wise?
Well, I had a very bittersweet feeling, you know.
Sure.
When I was writing it, it became clearer and clearer to me that I will eventually leave Hong Kong and
Mhm.
migrate for the second time in my life. So, I think in some ways, Hong Kong was a perfect halfway place for Chinese immigrants, you know, for people who are not fully resolute to leave their cultural homeland.
Hmm.
But a halfway place doesn't last long. And, you know, I felt at the time there was this local Hong Kong band called My Little Airport, and they had a song singing about wanting to fly away, but misses home the moment she lands.
Yeah.
I would still cry to that song even
Uh,
after hearing it for so long, because I feel, you know, it portrays this complexity of migration so well, and
yeah.
it's written in Chinese. It's a language I started to speak less and less. Yeah, so, you know, that emotion brought by migration by changing locale it's in a story.
Now with the language portion of it, I think I was reading something about, in the story, your main character, she starts learning English over Chinese, or was it Mandarin was what she was learning at the time?
Yeah, she was speaking mostly Mandarin in
Okay.
school at the time.
Okay. And I remember I was reading through your things here, and it said that she was getting frustrated with not being able to communicate the way she wanted to using
Mhm.
her native language, and so her father was teaching her in secret how to speak English. So, I mean, is that
Mhm.
something you experienced as well, like fighting kind of that wanting to express yourself, but not knowing how to, and having to kind of search for different methodologies to do that?
Right. You know, every language frees and frustrates in different ways, right? So I feel like in my book, I want to provide, an option to expand your thinking with a different tool. It doesn't have to be English.
No, no, of
It
course
can
not.
be any language that's not your native language, right?
Absolutely.
So English was my second language I learned in school and, from my father as well.
Mm.
So I naturally turned into English. I think for Chinese, it's very much still a pictographic language. So every character is composed of different radicals, and each radical represents the shape of its meaning in nature. So, for example, the word mountain looks like a mountain with three peaks in
Oh, cool.
Chinese. So it's like a painting, right? The character water looks like water with the motion of waves.
Interesting.
And in my novel, I mentioned that this pictographic trait of the Chinese language allows people to have a shared imagination and therefore create a very close-knit community.
Hmm.
On the other hand, I think there are downsides to it. So if your character mountain looks like mountain with three peaks, is it easy for you to imagine a mountain with four peaks or other shapes, right?
Mm.
And another example is the character man is composed of radicals of field and strength. So a man means somebody who is strong enough to work in a field.
Mm.
And the character married woman, for example, is made up of radicals woman and a broom. So yeah, woman who sweeps. So what does that say about this shared imagination of a married woman, right?
That's the thing too, yeah.
Right. So these are some of the limitations, some of the boundaries of thinking I want to push through. And I know a lot of people who are multilingual, they're doing precisely this without thinking too much about it. But I wanted to make it a more conscious process. So it may still inform some people who are still seeking for these options.
Interesting. Interesting. That's very intriguing about the symbolism between the symbol for individual people. It kind of puts them, kind of pigeonholes them into a certain role. They
Hmm.
have to be strong, to work in, like you said, in this case, the character says in the fields, or a married woman to be, at home sweeping. It's like it's very rigid. It's a very rigid, definition it looks like. But when you look at other languages,
Hmm.
you don't have that literal picture of it because it's not a pictographic type
Hmm.
writing. So you can kind of create your own definition of what a married woman or married man, or man, woman are, just from your own experiences. And that means when you meet someone and you can have those shared experiences, you can talk about it, and that will expand your mind and your meaning about those symbols or those people. So it's very interesting to think about. Now I'm
Hmm.
actually curious about during the time when you were living in China, it was the one child rule or law. Was that actually a law? You could only have one child.
Right, right. It's a mandate.
And
So
yeah, could you
yeah.
talk a little about that? I'm still fascinated by this. Like, how can you regulate this? Anyway. I'll let you talk.
Yeah, it's definitely of a one of a kind thing in history,
Yeah.
I think the mandate started in 1979 and it
Mhm.
lasts till 2015. So
Okay.
only very recently it ended. Of course, there's a lot of well-reported repercussions for this mandate, such as gender racial imbalances,
Mm.
forced abortions. We've all heard of that. But as someone who's experiencing it, I think I noticed that, women like my mother, who had only one child, was able to have a career, unlike women of her previous generations. I was also fortunate that I was born in a city. So I think at least in cities, girls had the same educational opportunities as boys
Okay.
as a result of this
Yeah.
mandate. But of course, there's a lot of other things. There's this loneliness, right? Which I wrote about in my book.
Yeah.
This huge expectations from our parents, who missed out their educational prospects during the Cultural Revolution. And, it was really strange. China has always favors to have as many children as possible. My
Mm.
father has three siblings. My mother had six siblings, which was common for their generation.
Yeah.
But we suddenly
Just
grew up in a household filled with adults and not many peers. So I think that this huge expectation, we had a term at the time, expecting your son to become a dragon and your daughter to become a phoenix. I think it only increased that competition and
mm.
isolation we all felt.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was strange.
I would imagine the little kids would have they would want to grow up fast because they're around adults all the time. There's no, like you said, minimum amount of peers. I mean, really, when you think about it, if you grow up with, siblings, I had numerous siblings myself. So they're a lot, some of my closest friends are my siblings because we grew up in the same household and only a couple years apart. So you really do a great job of growing up and you have certain responsibilities as you get older and it's a really neat dynamic. Now, mind you, you never had any kind of alone privacy. That was never a thing. So I mean, that was kind of a beautiful part of being an only child. I kind of envied my cousin for that. He was an only child too. But he had the same issue. He'd either stay inside and be alone, or he would go out and venture out. So it kind of forced him to just go be super social. And in doing so, he's very well known in the area. So I can talk to anybody and they almost know him. It's kind of hilarious. Now, was this something that was encouraged when you were growing up as to go and meet more people? I mean, was that something like your parents go meet people, go, establish relationships, bonds with people your age? Or was it more, no, you have expectations, educational expectations, you have to stick to those? Was there a good balance at all, or how did that work for you?
I actually had a pretty good, happy childhood,
Hmm.
upon till like age 10, I
Yeah,
would say, until I went to, the study in my primary school became serious.
sure.
So, yeah, in my childhood, I lived in this housing development called Longtang, which is like a narrow lane, and there are houses on either side of this lane.
Hmm.
So it's a very close-knit community. People know each other, and I was always just playing in this lane by myself or with other kids
Oh,
growing
good.
up,
Yeah.
while my parents are not around.
Hmm.
So there was always an adult keeping an eye on
Oh,
you, So yeah, I had a pretty, I would say free range
that's good.
childhood. Right. But then school started, and then we had these important examinations to enter a good primary school, middle school, and high school.
Oh, okay.
So that pressure started to become really, serious when I was later in primary school.
Interesting, interesting. So when do you guys start school then? I know for us it's 5 years old when you start kindergarten. Is that the same way? You start about 5 years old and go through, and then you go up from there, or how did that work?
Before kindergarten, there is nursery school.
Okay.
You know, I think kindergarten started a little earlier
Oh, really?
in
Okay.
China. Yeah. And then primary school starts at around age 6 and 7.
Oh, okay. Sweet, sweet, sweet. Yeah,
Right.
that's yeah, very similar here. We have, the nurseries and preschools and everything kids can go into.
Right.
A lot of those kids do, and they can sometimes learn. Sometimes they're more used for daycare than they are actually a preschool. But
Hmm.
whatever. I can see a difference there. My wife teaches kindergarten. She says there's a huge difference between kids who did preschool and those who just came in out of the house with not a lot of, preemptive strike knowledge with education. And he goes, there's a huge growth spike that happens during that time. So it's pretty wild. Hey all, if you've made it this far on purpose and enjoyed yourself, consider joining the Mighty Books Podcast Patreon. There, you get mighty benefits like early access to new episodes, exclusive members only content, and even free audiobooks. It's a great way to enjoy more insightful interviews, fun conversations, and more mighty stories. Finally, it supports the show so I can continue to deliver top-notch content to you, my mighty listeners. Thanks again for everything, and as always, stay mighty and keep reading. So, when did the book come out?
So it was published in Hong Kong at the end of
Oh,
2023.
cool.
Right. Yeah, it sounded like a long time ago, but it's actually just a year old.
Yeah, not that long ago. Yeah, yeah. It's only beginning 25 now. So what feedback have you gotten so far?
I think so far it has been really encouraging. I recently had an interview just a couple months ago, and he told me that my novel was one of the three best novels he read this year, and he read
Wow.
quite a bit. So I
Wow.
was really happy to hear that. I
Yeah,
know,
I'm kidding.
a book is not for everybody, but I think so far for the people who enjoyed the novel, they really loved it.
Good.
And last year, when I was moving to the US,
Yeah.
I had some challenges about promoting this book because
Yeah.
we moved from Hong Kong to New York just a week after my book's launch party.
Oh, shoot.
Right. Yeah. So I found it extremely difficult to publicize the book in Hong Kong afterwards. And I was feeling a little lost for a few months. But at the time, I had received this great review from a professor in Hong Kong Baptist University.
Oh, cool.
So I applied for a grant before my novel was published, and as part of that grant in Hong Kong, they asked people in academia to write a paragraph recommendation for your project. But instead of just one paragraph, this professor wrote a 6-page recommendation for my novel. Yeah, I was so moved and, feeling so grateful
Yeah.
that because he doesn't even know me, and I felt this book is worth writing and it is actually worth getting the word out.
Yeah.
Early encouragement is so important. It gives you a huge confidence boost, right?
Ab- Absolutely. Yeah, especially with something like this where it's a lifetime project your book is. Yeah, we people think, "Oh, I'll just write a book and it'll be no, now you want it. You want to the whole point of writing a story is to and especially your case, you're sharing a story that's very personal. And as you said, you kind of want to bridge the gap between different viewpoints, politically, socioeconomically. The only way you're going to make any kind of change or moving mindsets is by getting it in front of people and having them read it. So it's quite a job to market this thing to what's going to make people want to pick it up and go, huh, I want to spend X amount of hours diving into this person's story. And that takes a lot of effort. It takes so much time and energy. So what
Right.
what marketing, I know obviously doing podcasts. What other marketing are you doing for US? Are you doing anything different for US versus China?
Right. So, actually, I didn't have too much publicity in Hong Kong because
Sure.
of my move.
Yeah. Fair.
And I think in the US, I didn't, in the beginning of this journey, I didn't get any luck walking into a bookstore in New York as representing myself and trying to have them read a book.
It's hard.
So I had, yeah, eventually after I got that really positive review from the professor I mentioned, it inspired me to find a publicist.
Oh, cool.
So I found a really good one and really happy with her team. And apart from good podcasts like
Mhm.
yours,
Absolutely.
I'm also doing some editorials. Just last year, I wrote a piece on censorship and banned books.
Hmm.
This is a topic very familiar to me, of course.
Hmm.
And I did some Instagram tour. I now have a press kit with a press release in it, put
Mm.
together by the publicist. So last year, just before Christmas, my family who lives in DC, they walked into a bookstore with the press kit, and the owners actually they agreed to take a look.
Nice.
And later they came back to me. They said they enjoyed the book and they wanted to do an event this coming spring featuring my book. So
Fabulous.
yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, very nervous too, but
Oh, yeah.
very excited at the same time.
Yeah, you got to get in front of people and talk about it. It's a little,
Right,
it's a little
right.
frightening. Have you done events like that before?
Apart from my launch party, I did a launch party in Hong
Oh, that's right.
Kong. Yeah, this is the first one in the US. So
Ooh, that's pretty exciting. That is very exciting. A little intimidating, but I think, it's your story. You're the expert on it. You got this. So I think that's so cool. Your family walked in and did that for you?
yes, yes, my mother-in-law actually.
That's fantastic. I love that. Yeah, get the family involved. That's a good way to do this.
Right.
You can only
Yeah.
speak so much about it, and I always felt weird about speaking more about, your published works. You're like, no, I don't know. I don't like being braggy. So but you got to talk about yourself some way. But that's really cool. You're going to get a chance to speak and hopefully get some good attention and, get some people to enjoy it and they can learn from it. That would be really cool.
Thank
Learn
you. I
about
hope so. Yeah.
yeah, I wish you good luck with that. That's for sure. And then just hopefully you can do more of those as time goes on. Just kind of chit chatting and have a good time with future readers. That would be a really exciting thing to have done. So
Right.
yeah, hopefully some good stuff comes from that. That's amazing. So I know you're busy marketing this book. It just came out not that long ago. I know you said 2023 is not really not that long ago. Are you planning on doing future works, or are you going to really focus on this book?
So I'm just starting to think about my future project.
Yeah.
I have a 3-year-old and she is, because of migration and everything, she's just going to school
Yeah.
for the whole, full time this
Hmm.
semester. So I'm finally having a little bit mental space to think about my own writing. You
Yeah.
know how that is.
I do. Yeah.
So yeah, I think, you know, motherhood will be a theme, I think, because there's a lot of things to untangle during the past few years.
Yeah.
And I'm finally having a little more distance from that sleep deprived, overly anxious person I was, for the past few years. And I
Hmm.
hope that will turn into real perspective,
Yeah.
and, on new parenthood. And another thing I'm always very interested in is Chinese folk tales.
Oh,
So
cool.
I grew up with my grandparents, just like my protagonist in the
Yeah.
novel. So we didn't have much entertainment on TV at the time. Everything was boring for a child. But they are very fond of this regional opera called Yue opera. And in opera, there's a lot of folk tales and some stories with historical context.
Yeah.
So these are some of my earliest stories. And I was fascinated by them. I like the story about the white snake, where a snake turns into a woman's shape. She marries a scholar and later becomes a doctor to cure difficult diseases.
Interesting.
You know,
Interesting.
yeah, eventually she was captured by a monk and trapped under a pagoda. That didn't end up very well. But it's an interesting story. And of course, there's the story of the famous Monkey King. You probably have heard of it.
I've
Yeah.
heard of that. Yeah.
So, yeah, so for readers not familiar with it, the Monkey King is a very rebellious monkey. He doesn't have parents, so he was born from a rock, and he travels to heaven and hell, and he even tries to eliminate his name from the book of life and death so that he could be immortal. Um,
Oh,
yeah, so
okay.
I think these stories, with fantastical elements, they express a need for people, especially in China, for people who lived under authoritarian rules for so long.
Yeah.
They need a channel to deal with that kind of helplessness and the helplessness against fleeting life itself in general. There's also another type of story with historical context. So in my novel, I mentioned this story of Xi Shi, who is a beautiful woman
Hmm.
responsible for the downfall of two neighboring kingdoms in about 200 BC. So later, of course, you realize that women is often seen as scapegoats in Chinese history, in
Okay.
particular,
Yeah.
as downfall as the down for the reason for the downfall of kingdoms.
Jeez.
So this might be in the interest of the ruling class, to promote these ideas.
Yeah.
When I was a child, our textbook have a very brief mention of the Cultural Revolution. And guess who's responsible for it? It's not Mao Zedong himself, it's Mao's wife, you
Oh.
know?
Hmm.
Yes,
Let's just
yes,
shove
who's
that blame off of, yeah, let's just shove that blame off. Yeah. That's insane.
right. But people bought it because, there are roots of this kind of narrative in your early stories, right?
Mm,
So
okay.
I'm really
That's
intrigued to
interesting.
investigate in because I have been starting to teach my toddler some of these early stories in
Yeah.
Chinese. So I know that a lot of writers and academics in the West, they're revisiting these classic tales. I'm recently rereading, the English writer Angela Carter has this story collection called The Bloody Chamber. It's really fascinating.
Hmm.
She rewrote the story of Beauty and Beast and Bluebeard and Little Red Riding Hood, all
Oh
that
yeah.
from a female perspective, and
Mhm.
I love that. And I find that I want to investigate the Chinese folk tales as well. So hopefully that element will work themselves into my next project as well.
That sounds really interesting, actually. So it would be you telling the stories, or they'd be an element in a fictional tale.
I haven't decided about
Okay.
that yet. I
Yeah.
want to include, not just one folk
Right.
tale, but,
Oh.
several. So,
Oh yeah. And I love looking at different cultures' folk tales and then kind of comparing multiple cultures. It's just interesting. Like the one you're talking about where they're blaming the women for the downfall of the kingdoms. Immediately thought of Adam and Eve in Christianity because a lot of the
hmm
times, well, Eve gave the apple. He made Adam eat it. It's like, well, he didn't have to eat the
right.
damn thing. I mean, it's just hilarious that the blame shame the shaming or blaming. And I'm like, that's a kind of interesting kind of connection, and just the different. I love to look at those and kind of unbox it and see where they came from. It's interesting, kind of the backwards, like almost a backwards reverse engineering where a story came
hmm
from, especially folk tales or fables or lore and whatnot. It's really interesting. But I love learning about that. It's just so interesting about the where the symbolism, where that came from. And there's a couple of kids stories books my boys have, and there's something about a fabled. It was a Chinese folk tale, and I'm gonna butcher. I think it was like a dragon and a phoenix and like some kind of lake or a mountain or something like that. I can't remember what it's called. Maybe it sparks anything in your memory. I don't know. I'll have to find the book, but anyway, it just popped in my mind. I'm like, I think that was one. Anyway, I'm rambling now. I'm rambling now.
hmm
With your book. that you currently have out, and then the current next one, what research did you have to do, or is it mostly just right out of your brain, out of your memories? It was a lot of research you had to do?
Yeah, some research about historical events.
Yeah.
For the novel South of the Yangtze, because the characters' personal lives are really interwoven
Okay.
with historical events. The Tiananmen Square massacre is a big part of the story.
Sure.
And I also mentioned, the beginning of the Hong Kong protests in 2010. And earlier, there's the SARS epidemic in 2003.
Mm.
There's some of the factual things. I was doing research to make sure they're, coherent.
Got everything right. And then did your editor have to kind of go look and check everything, or were they pretty secure with your knowledge and research on it? They didn't really have to do much checking.
Yeah, not that much background checking.
Oh,
I
good.
think I did face some pressure, to rephrase
Oh,
and
really?
to delete some content, for
Mm.
censorship reasons.
Mm. Okay.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
it is an issue.
Yeah. Yeah, the censorship. How much did you have to deal with publishing it in China? I know you said censorship is kind of was a big thing. How
Hmm.
challenging was that to navigate?
That's why I decided to write the book in English because I
Oh,
don't
okay.
want that kind of limitation.
No.
Yeah, because you can see that in Hong Kong, even the freedom is very quickly diminishing. I think for me, there is actually a great sadness in choosing to write in a different language. My
I
story
imagine.
is told, but people who can potentially resonate with it the most may not be able to read it. I think that is the dilemma for a lot of writers, coming out of their authoritarian governments and try to write in a different language.
Yeah.
Um, I think fortunately for me that, in Hong Kong, there is still some window to talk about history. And people are usually multilingual there.
Yeah.
So I think I imagine my audience is not only people whose native language is English, but also anyone who can read in English, including the Chinese audience.
Hmm. So are English books banned over in China, or just certain like historic what is banned over there exactly?
Well, a lot of mostly Chinese books,
Yeah.
books about the current Chinese leaders, of course,
Mm,
are banned, and the booksellers, in Hong Kong got into trouble. Yeah, it was in the headlines in Hong Kong for a while.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really difficult. The a lot of things cannot be freely discussed,
Yeah, no.
in the Chinese language.
That's too bad. It just limits exploration and knowledge, and that if you can't learn from what we've done in the past, we can't fix the future. We can't make the future good. And that's a serious problem. Limiting knowledge for anyone.
Hmm.
If anyone says, "Oh, well, we don't want them to learn," like, okay, that's a huge red flag. That's a gigantic red flag.
Right.
The whole banned book thing is just wild to me. To think that we don't want people to read and understand history, or I know the leaders don't want them to be seen in a negative light. And I'm thankful that for the most part, in the US at least, and other countries, that it's like leaders, like if people don't like you, they don't like you. Get over it. It's just kind of how you have to live with it. But with the control that they've got over in China, it's a kind of a scary thing. Do you think the relations are getting worse over there or getting better?
Well, I think in recent years, unfortunately, I think it's moving in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very sad. I think the government is a little bit insecure
Sure.
at the
Yeah.
moment. Yeah, so there's a very big control
Yeah.
over everything.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and unfortunately, people just can't take control back necessarily, not in a quick way at least. It to change cultures takes generations and years. It's a very glacial movement. But hopefully with something like your book, where you do look at kind of what it sounds like is yours is a very macro and a microscopic look at the experience you dealt with. You have the huge political climate you dealt with, and then it's
Mhm.
also how that impact on an individual and an individual's family. So when someone can read that, they can really see and take time to kind of churn over that the emotions and the reality of what you experienced, and then really hopefully have a good connection, at least have some kind of understanding. Because that's, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people just don't know what's going on over there. I mean, myself included, I don't know. I don't have an intimate knowledge of what's going on in most countries. There's a lot of stuff happening over here. There's just
Right,
there's things going on.
right. Yeah.
But yeah, but speaking like you are on podcasts, doing long form stuff like this, having conversations, meeting people like in the books, like in the event you're going to be having in the near future. I mean,
Mhm.
that really is a great step in the right direction. Getting people just to acknowledge that there's something going on and to understand it and talk about it. That's really how you're going to change culture. It's inch by inch, unfortunately, not mile by mile. But what you're doing is a great step in the right direction, I think.
Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I think as you said, the personal is the political, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the vice versa. So I think essentially, I feel it is the novelist's job not just to it's not the novelist's job to promote political ideas,
Mm,
but actually to detail the nuances in humanity. Because essentially we share the same fears and desires, regardless
absolutely.
of our upbringing and where we are,
I
right?
agree. I
Yeah.
100% agree. Yeah, no, that's totally right. I don't think, yeah, the novelist, if you're taking this time to write something down and create something like this, you're generally someone who's rather reflective and you don't usually have a political agenda or anything. You're just trying to convey a message and a story to hopefully bring understanding to the readers for what you have experienced or for what an area has experienced. It's just a different perspective. And I think when people are open to various perspectives and they have a calm head about it and they have knowledge and understanding, that's the best way we're going to be moving forward and hopefully bringing more peace and harmony and not more turmoil.
Mhm.
That's
Right.
the
Yeah, hopefully.
that's the hope. That's the
Yeah.
hope. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, for China, everything happened so rapidly in
Yeah.
the 20th century. When I was growing up, I consider myself a millennial, but, a millennial growing up in China has such different upbringing than
Mm-hmm.
millennials growing up in the West. Because, in the 1980s, China was merely recovering from the Cultural Revolution, right? And everything is just picking up from the ruins. And poverty was predominant.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents used to tell me that everybody earns the same salary of 36 yuan a month,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of what they do.
Wow.
You could be a scientist building an atom bomb, or you could be selling snacks on the street. You'll be
Wow.
earning the same salary.
Mm.
But then, just in a few years, the planned economy changed into market economy, and people don't earn the same salary anymore,
Yeah.
right? And then the stock market happened, and a lot of people went into it and became very wealthy very quickly. So just within these, couple of decades, you see China was recovering from the trauma of Cultural Revolution,
Wow.
to changing into the major player in the world. So I think that was very confusing for my parents, these changes of game rules and societal values. And it was very confusing for someone like me who grew up during this
Yeah.
era. I think in the West, we read a lot of good novels from Chinese writers, both in English and Chinese, from my parents' generation,
Hmm.
writing about the Cultural Revolution and
Yeah.
what's happening before that. I think I don't see so much from my generation yet. So I think, writing about the post-cultural revolution to modern days,
Yeah.
and I wanted to contribute to that part of the discussion.
Great. Well, it sounds like you're doing just that. So, I mean, keep up the good work and keep doing and keep talking, keep it in front of people. Keep it in front of people. Definitely.
All
And
right.
I definitely like that. It's very interesting. Just all this, the psychology behind it all, the economical aspects of everything. It's just very interesting and how I didn't think about how rapid them living from a very stringent society financially to going to, well, now we have a lot more money and t talk about the messing with the mind of the value of a person's occupation. I mean,
Hmm.
to me, it's just so crazy. The same if you're saving lives as a doctor versus picking up trash. Now, mind you, someone who's a sanitary engineer, someone who's picking up trash, it is important. We got to keep our places safe and clean. But there's a higher value on someone who has the knowledge and skills to bring someone back to health versus someone who's picking up stuff who's, necessarily unskilled labor. But if everyone's been paid the same, man, that's got to mess with the mind over time. So, and then to reverse that midlife, wow, what? I can't even think about how that would just kind of completely throw any I don't know predisposition of society out the window. It's just fascinating how that much. So you've taught me quite a bit already in the last hour. So I'm sure other people would like to actually start learning a little bit from you more too. So where can they get copies of South of the Yangtze?
So my book is on Amazon, both in paperback and Kindle version. So if you live in Hong Kong, you can also order from the Chinese University of Hong Kong Press, which is the distributor of my publisher.
Mhm.
It may get you faster than Amazon in Hong Kong, but I don't know how many of your listeners are in Hong Kong.
Right.
So Amazon is the best way to get it generally. And you can connect with me through my website, floraqian.com, FLORAQIAN.com. I'm on Goodreads.
Mhm.
So feel free to follow me there. And if you enjoy my book, give a good review.
Definitely give
Yes.
reviews. Definitely give reviews. Oh,
Yeah, it's
mhm. It's a struggle these
and
days.
right,
Yeah.
right. It's hard. And I'm also on Instagram.
Excellent. Excellent. So they can find you. They can find you. Excellent. And hopefully
Right.
you'll be doing some live events too. You got the one coming up in, you said April? Is that what you said, April?
Mhm. I think
Springtime.
it's going to be in yeah, springtime. It's going to be in May in
Oh,
DC.
man.
So
Yes.
yeah.
That's super cool. Excellent. Well, I wish you the best with that, and I hope it blows up for you and you get the word out there and people read it like crazy and start to understand what the heck's going on and what your experience was. So, but Flora, this has been fabulous. I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me today. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule with your writing, your marketing, your raising your daughter, and to come chat with me. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for having me, Ryan.
You're very welcome. And for future purposes, if you've got more stuff coming down eventually, when you get a chance to get your second one going, if you want to come back and promote some more, I'd be happy to facilitate another interview.
Oh, I would love to. Thank you. That's great.
You're welcome, very much so. All right, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this conversation between me and Flora. Go check out her book, South of the Yangtze by Flora Qian. I hope you guys really enjoyed this. Have a great rest of your day. And as always, stay mighty and keep reading.